Welcome to the next very interesting panel at Yiddish and the Holocaust, New Approaches. This panel is entitled New Yiddish Diasporas from Poland to Sweden, Part 1. My name is Karolina Koprowska. I work in the Warsaw Ghetto Museum, and I have a pleasure today to speak to 4 wonderful panelists. Simo Muir from the University College London, Rachel Moss from Colgate University, Karolina Koprowska from Jagiellonian University, and Aleksandra Gluba-Pieprz from Adam Mickiewicz University. We have each panelist will have 15 minutes, which will be strictly adhered to. And afterwards, we'll have time for questions, both from conference participants and from the general public. So, since we only have an hour and a half, an hour 45 minutes, yes. Let's start, and I would like to ask Simo Muir to start with his presentation.
Thank you. So I'm talking about the meaning of Yiddish performance in dealing with the trauma of Holocaust survivors in Sweden. Polish Jewish actress Nusha Gold was the first foreign Yiddish touring performer to arrive in Sweden in 1946. She played an important role in the cultural and psychological rehabilitation of survivors in Sweden. In her performances, she combined classics of the Yiddish theater with pieces created during and after the Holocaust. In this paper, I will discuss 2 issues: psychological rehabilitation through performing arts among Holocaust survivors in Sweden, and the meaning of Yiddish language, theater, and literature in the rehabilitation process. I ask, what type of psychological thinking was behind this Yiddishist approach among professional actors, and why particularly a Yiddish Wort, Yiddish language literature, was seen as an irreplaceable asset and tool in dealing with the trauma of the Churban, the Holocaust. After the war, Sweden became a Scandinavian center of Holocaust survivors. With the rescue efforts of spring and summer 1945, over 10,000 Holocaust survivors were brought to Sweden. They were scattered across southern Sweden in hospitals, sanatoria, and convalescent homes. Several well-known, originally Polish Jewish actors toured among the surviving remnant from 1946 to 1948. Among them, Josef Glickson, Zipora Feinsilber, Hayele Grober, Rosa and Zygmunt Turkov, and Nusha Gold. Besides performances in bigger towns, especially important and meaningful for the survivors were their visits in care facilities and refugee centers. Current research literature discusses various types of psychological rehabilitation aimed at the survivors. As well known, the survivors lived in a highly politicized environment, which also affected the psychological care they received or didn't receive. The psychological rehabilitation available then can be generally divided into 2 main types. Rehabilitation based on advanced Western psychology and psychiatry, also including forms of art therapy, and secondly, rehabilitation influenced by political and ideological thinking, namely Zionism and religious Judaism. What I'm interested in exploring here and in my current research is Yiddish performing arts as a therapeutic means to deal with the trauma of the Holocaust. It falls between the 2 main strains explored in literature, between Western psychology and ideological thinking. Nusha Gold is best remembered from her appearance as the headmistress of a Jewish orphanage in the semi-documentary Yiddish film Unsere Kinder, Our Children, from 1948, which Rivka Margoles included in her excellent presentation on Sunday. As discussed, the film features the famed comedians Shimon Chigan and Israel Schumacher. Rachel Auerbach took responsibility for the dialogues in the film. The film has a fundamental discussion about the importance of reenacting traumatic events in order to gain emotional release from them, and the possibilities of performance as an artistic expression of and the possibilities performance and artistic expression offer for children as well as adults in dealing with trauma of the Holocaust. Let us listen to the dialogue in the film by Nusha Gold, Shimon Chigan and Israel Schumacher. Sorry.
Mir gefällt ausgezeichnet sein Plan, als die Kinder sollen szenisieren ihre Überlebungen.
Sie halten Tage Bämmes als zweckmäßig, als die Kinder sollen auffrischen sehr schreckliche Überlebnisse.
Ich halte, als wenn wir da dritten sie bei Tag, die Dose für sich freuen, und sie bei den Kindern kapoor gekommen bei Nacht, in Chaloimes und Schmarren.
Wir haben du oft Mut gehabt, als wir gefahren.
Nun heim.
Platz?
Nein, ich trage wegen Konkurs, was der Kisten will machen.
Alle schlafen schon. Wer schläft, fällt mir nicht ein. Ich sag euch. Halt was ich will.
Es muss für viel ist gut dazu.
Der einzige Weg von unserer Erziehung, von unserer Übererziehung von den Kindern und wie von den Erwachsenen, ist zu geben die Überlebungen einen schöpferischen, befreienden Inhalt.
Oh, ihr redet nur wegen Sachen, was haben Sie ins Gura-Noten Scheiches. Was ist eigentlich die Aufgabe vom Theater, oder nicht bloß Einanderludenen, die neuswertigen, tragischen Inhalten auf einen schöpferischen Auf?
I think I didn't put the full screen, so now it should be better. 50 years later, well-known Holocaust historians Lawrence Langer criticized this approach. He considered the above discussion as, quote, simple-minded view of art as a form of therapy and the children as patients who simply needed to be cured of their bad memories, end quote. All in all, Langer believed that there was no real cure for Holocaust trauma, or at least it couldn't be dealt with through conventional ways. Can we dismiss the approach discussed in the film so categorically? After all, the screenplay was by Auerbach and well-known actors who themselves had survived under various circumstances and were closely working with other survivors. What was the psychological thinking behind the lines in the film? Where did this thinking stem from among Polish Jews? The idea to use tragedy for catharsis goes back to Aristotle, but the specific connection between trauma and therapy didn't emerge until the late 19th century. One direct clue is given in the film. As the actors discuss the meaning of performance, one can see the image of Janusz Korczak above the piano. Korczak is known to have encouraged his wards to use tragedy creatively. He urged them to perform Rabindranath Tagore's The Post Office about the death of a child. Around the time of shooting the film, Nusha Gold arrived in Sweden for a second visit to perform and to work and perform among the survivors. Besides monologues, her performances included melodeclamatias, recitation of Holocaust poetry with piano accompaniment. The poems allowed listeners to process painful experiences and to put into words things that were otherwise difficult or impossible to talk about. For instance, her Malmö performance in February 1948 included a recitation of the 9th poem of Yitzhak Katzenelson's well-known long poem, Das Lied von oss der argeten jiddischen Volk, the song of the murdered Jewish people, which expresses anger and utter disappointment towards humankind. According to the review in the Malmö-based survivor journal Die Stimme, Gold's recitation of the poem was spine-chilling. The absolute high point, however, of the evening was her performance of Sholem Ashi's Der Marsch von die Kedoshim, the March of the Martyrs. This emotive piece was recited to the melody of Chopin's Funeral March. Whether the dramatization of Ashi's piece was by Gold herself remains unknown. The piece, originally named as Der Triumphmarsch, had been published in Ashi's book called Der Brennendiger Dorn, The Burning Bush, in 1946 in New York. The piece tells how, in the wake of the Soviet forces' triumphal march in Warsaw, the murdered Jews of the town appear to their own march in an endless succession, a group after a group, every segment of the Warsaw Jewry. This dreamlike scene ends when the traumatized living Jewish survivors emerge from the rubble. It could be argued that through Gold's performance, survivors in the audience could imagine the fate of their loved ones, and through retelling the horrors, they could attain emotional release. Gold, as her peers, included also a lot of pre-war Yiddish literature in their repertoire. This can be seen also in the way Gigan and Schumacher in Unsere Kinder performed scenes from Sholem Aleichem's Asreife in Kasrilevke, The Fire in Kasrilevke, which becomes associated with the fires during the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. This Yiddishist approach was again criticized by Lawrence Langer. Langer questioned, can children of the Holocaust remain children of the Jewish worldview of Sholem Aleichem? Has there been a rupture in continuity, and do efforts to repair it represent a falsification of experience, especially recent Jewish experience? At least actor Josef Glickson believed firmly that the rupture in the continuity, if there had been such, could be repaired. Glickson and his actress wife Zipporah Feinsilber arrived in Sweden in 1946 and toured like Nusha Gold in the sanatoria and convalescent homes for 2 years. Before the war, they had been members of the Warsaw radical and experimental Jungtheater. Glicksons believed in the transformative power of performance and art in general, which transcends mere entertainment. Usually, the first part of their program was devoted to the Holocaust. The second part was already more humorous and included works that looked into the future. In his memoirs published in the Yiddish Journal of the World Jewish Congress in Sweden, Glickson writes about their work among the surviving remnant in Sweden and about the meaning of Yiddish language performance in the cultural and psychological rehabilitation. He wrote, "Ihre Herzer seien durchgenommen mit der Bänkschaft, sich zu beheften mit den Scheures von jüdischem Volk, mit seinem Mechus, mit dem Hoffnungsgeist, was strömt in der jiddischen Literatur. Sie fielen, als durch dem, der nennten sie sich zu sehr Neuenste, zu die tragisch Umgekommene." And he elaborates elsewhere. Sie wollen sich heim beheften mit dem jiddischen Wort. Sie wollen sich der vielen Neuen zum jiddischen Volk. Ohne Glauben in sehr eigener Zukunft, wie in der Zukunft von ganzen jiddischen Klau. Let us return to Unsere Kinder for a moment before my final remarks. In a very emotional scene in the middle of the film, Nusha Gold, as the headmistress, breaks down as she has flashbacks of the moment when her child was taken from her during a selection. In the background, we can hear how Israel Schumacher sings a very well-known song from pre-war Poland and Eastern Europe, Toivn, doves. This sentimental song about longing after a loved one, as many pre-war songs, got new meaning during and after the Holocaust. Karolina Koprowska sang it in her concerts in Sweden, in a section devoted to the commemoration of the victims of the Holocaust. For Gold, as well as Glickson and Feinsilber and Grober, performing Yiddish repertoire from the pre-war era transcended mere entertainment. For them, pre-war Yiddish literature and entertainment was as important as new works created during and after the Holocaust. They saw this as an important anchor that connected the survivors with their past and loved ones. Ultimately, they believed that through art, survivors could relive and reenact painful memories and gain emotional release from them, which would help them in their psychological rehabilitation and healing process. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you very much. And our next speaker is Rachel Moss from Colgate University. And if I can just remind you, of course, you are very welcome to write questions into the chat, of course, as we listen to the papers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to the conference organizers and the Goldrich Institute for putting this together. It's very exciting to be here remotely with you all. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm delighted to follow Simo's presentation, in which I'm looking more, again, at the Yiddish theater and Yiddish repertoire, but looking actually to new work and putting those into conversation with the past as well. So, as the dust settled in the aftermath of World War II, surviving Jews returned to Poland from concentration and displaced person camps, as well as from safe havens in parts east. Though accounting for a small percentage of the once vibrant Yiddish theater world of pre-war Poland, the returning artists formed the basis for two Yiddish theaters, one in the far west, the Dolnośląski Teatr Żydowski in the new old territory of Wrocław, and one in the post-industrial Warsaw-adjacent city of Łódź, which had been a richly theatrical place prior to the war. In a sense, the plurality of Jewish theaters evoked a whisper of the country's pre-war history, which supported numerous Yiddish theaters countrywide. Within the first decade of the post-war period, these two theaters consolidated and relocated to Poland's capital, but their initial separation provides double the repertoire to examine in the immediate period following the Second World War. These post-war Yiddish theaters publicly enacted questions surrounding Jewish positionality in Poland within early post-war narratives of the Holocaust, the Shoah, through their range of repertoire. This paper focuses on preliminary research into new Yiddish plays that premiered in Poland in the post-war era, specifically, if implicitly, that addressed the war. My focus today will be on Chaim Slovis's Hamans Mapola, which you also heard about in Joel Berkowitz's presentation on Sunday, which premiered at the Dolnośląski Teatr Żydowski in 1949, and the Yiddish production of Leon Krzyzkowski's Julius and Ethel, which ran simultaneous to the Polish language world premiere of the play in 1954. This production took place at Państwowy Teatr Żydowski, playing in both Wrocław and Łódź. Each of these productions offered differing approaches to humor and pathos as their strategic dramaturgy that raised questions for the audience about their own sense of wartime destruction and post-war Jewish positionality. Their contrasting approaches to Jewish loss alongside post-war Jewish optimism further highlights their role within larger conversations in which Jewish survivors and returnees sought to understand their place in a, quote, po-Żydowski Polish world. And here I'm using the Polish language neologism that was coined after World War II, denoting things as formerly or post-Jewish. So beginning with Hamans Mapola in 1949, modeled on a traditional raucous Purim spiel in which the Book of Esther is performed with vaudevillian zest, and during which audience participation is not so much encouraged as demanded. Chaim Slovis wrote Haman's Mapola in 1940, just prior to Hitler's entry into Paris. In his thinly veiled allegory, Haman HaRasha, the classically evil advisor to King Ahasuerus, is determined to kill all the Jews after feeling that a Jew in the court, Mordechai HaTzadik, publicly insulted him. Through the use of updated terminology, such as the descriptor Aryan, a running gag about intentionally disguising Jewish heritage. For example, my Jewish grandmother had no children. Her many children certified that. Here, Haman clearly depicts Hitler in this context. By the time the play circulated in performance across Europe between 1945 and 49, as Jews returned from liberated camps and Far Eastern exile, it was material that supported the Jewish mission to find what Annette Aronovich has somewhat paradoxically outlined as, quote, a new secular mode of expression intimately tied to the very revival of the Jewish people, unquote. This genre of cultural work emphasized solidarity through language and cultural practice beyond a specifically religious framework. An assimilationist response and strategy we see worldwide in the aftermath of the Shoah, as Jewish survivors intentionally turned more towards institutionalization of Jewish culture practices and away from Judaism more broadly. Within this post-war milieu, Aronovich reads the play as a commentary on the secularization of the Purim tradition that moves away from conceptions of Jews as the chosen people and therefore doomed to uniquely suffer. At the same time, however, through the characterization of Mordechai's Volksstimmlichkeit, religious, if explicitly Yiddish phrasing, the play points to the proximity of the war and Jews' sudden belief in the, quote, fact that they had survived such an onslaught as a sign of their exceptional destiny as people, unquote. In other words, as Aronovich clarifies, the play displays how, quote, the new understanding of the Jewish people, it is not chosen, coexists with the old, it is chosen, unquote. One of the principal ways the play does this is by emphasizing Haman, i.e. Hitler's deliberate destruction of numerous people, including the Jews, while the main plot maintains the narrative from the Book of Esther, with the destruction of Jews at some point becoming Haman's primary focus and ultimately the cause of his titular downfall. Additionally, the play modifies the Purim Spiel's original Mordechai insulting Haman plotline. In this retelling, Haman in fact develops at least sexual feelings for the beautiful Esther Hamalka, and he demands Mordechai's assistance in arranging a tryst. Mordechai double-crosses Haman, ultimately revealing to King Ahasuerus that his own second hand attempted to make covetous arrangements on the queen, leading to the eponymous downfall. In this version, Slovis therefore entwines a doubly complex statement. On the one hand, the narrative embeds a long-held Polish mythology about another exotic Jewess, also named Esther, or Esterka, in the case of the 14th century King Kazimierz Wielki's Jewish wife or lover, while on the other, noting Haman's lustful excess for the Jewish people as the trigger for his genocidal rage to follow. When it premiered at the Dolnośląski Teatr Żydowski, the surprisingly raucous comedy, further including one-liners such as "Where were you born?" "In my mother's bed," a rendition of the Yiddish song "Bulbus," and a repeated comic interludes that stem from Mordechai's role as the court shadchan. The play was billed unassumingly as a folkspiel, as Tevye the Dairyman often was. Though an advertising spread proclaiming the play's opening, sharing a page with a heartbreaking missing person ad in the bottom of the play, in the bottom of the advertising quadrant you'll see here on the left, underscores the difficulty that comedy might also have had in landing in that moment. One published theater review acknowledges the seeming authenticity of the production as itself a Purim spiel, noting that this production marked the first post-war iteration of Purim celebrations and the reading of the Book of Esther, two practices known from their, quote, long East European tradition, unquote. Reported as having played to crowds upwards of 8,000 people or more, the optimistic comedy with a happy ending perhaps resonated with audiences in its surprisingly lighthearted hopefulness. Those who had recently returned had endured enough to take heart, perhaps, in Mordecai's insistence to Esther, quote, Haman will pass, trouble will pass, like a bad dream, unquote. What's more, the use of direct address throughout the production, in which characters from the stage spoke directly to the audience, served to implicate the audience in the play's ultimate takeaway. All those who came to view the production were, for that moment, part of this spiel with a happy ending. Evading the implementation of Stalin's socialist realism that was introduced concurrent with the play's premiere in January 1949, the play's persistent Yiddishkeit openly performed and proclaimed a transnational Jewish identity as the audience enmeshed in the performances explored its own Polish-Jewish positionality in a post-war world. The play was produced as Polish-Jewish identity was still being rebuilt, with its post-war sense of self still very much in the making. Indeed, the question of continued Jewish presence in Poland at all was being openly addressed, particularly in the wake of post-war pogroms such as those in Kraków and Kielce, demonstrating to Jewish returnees that their place in Poland was far from stable. Meanwhile, post-war Jewish settlements developed in Poland's new Western territory, such as the community of Dzierżoniów in a mere 59 kilometers from Wrocław, created openings for the formation of new Polish-Jewish possibility, which were importantly often subsidized by transnational, mostly American Jewish support. Haman's Mapola seemed to speak to this transnational and ultimately optimistic takeaway about the certainty of Jewish futures and continued existence due to the universal appreciation of Haman's downfall. I won't go into this now, but I would also just note as an aside that Wrocław was also a city that itself had undergone extreme change and reallocation, a German settlement for this new Jewish population that had taken residence there. So in this context, with Haman's Mapola, the Dolnośląski Teatr Żydowski assumed a stance of optimistic performance, connecting Polish Jews with numerous European productions of the Yiddish play that were circulating at the same time. So to turn to 1954, Julius and Ethel. 5 years later, as the country existed well within Stalinist socialist realist restrictions and a firmer establishment of Soviet Communist Party lines, it experienced a national love affair with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The two recognizably American Jews who were tried and executed as Soviet spies in 1953 became a cause célèbre shortly after their initial imprisonment in New York in 1950. Newspaper coverage of their short trial and lengthy imprisonment and numerous appeals loudly broadcast the Rosenberg story to the Polish public. Avid followers of the grim tale were even able to get a glimpse into the final 6 hours of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's lives through the naturalistic and heroizing play Julius and Ethel, or Julius and Ethel, written by a man regarded as the official playwright of the Polish communist regime and former deputy minister of culture, Leon Strzyczkowski. This epic, at least 3 hours long drama focusing on the Rosenberg's final hours on death row in New York Sing Sing prison similarly saturated the theater-going public across Poland, not merely performing in 5 different cities in Polish and Yiddish productions, but also it ran across national airways as an adapted radio drama on public radio program Teatr Polskiego Radia, featuring the original Polish language cast. In terms of the Yiddish production, the play was translated and adapted by Ida Kamińska for the Państwowy Teatr Żydowski to overlap in production with the original Polish language version during the spring and summer of 1952, which also coincided with the first yard-side of the Rosenberg's execution. The play makes a universalizing gesture, with Jews becoming both a stand-in for the universal working man and the quintessential communist, thereby offering a compelling response to the longtime Judeo-Kommunist stereotype, or the prevalent stereotype of Jews being part of a grand Judeo-Bolshevik team that was still bandied about in early 1950s Poland. Set in Sing Sing prison, the play includes a full cast of characters involved in the real-life case. As you'll see, some of these characters pictured here, from the prosecution and defense attorneys in the office image there, to the Rosenberg's 10-year-old son, who is not pictured here, as well as their accuser, Davy Greenglass, who you see there in prison uniform. Still today referred to as a propaganda showpiece, though this play was never performed again in Poland after 1954, the Yiddish version actually has a legacy outside of the country, which I'm happy to talk about more in Q&A. The theatrical productions capitalized on the media saturation of the case in Poland, and it's important to note that in 1953, a compilation of their prison letters was published in Poland in Yiddish, and then in 1954, the compilation was published in Polish. Pervasively circulating information aside, however, an intriguing absence within Koprowska's play is the lack of any mention of the Rosenbergs' Jewishness. The Yiddish press coverage, however, underscored their obvious Jewish background. A long-form review of the play in Yiddish Schriften explicitly pointed to the Rosenbergs' Jewishness and praised the way that Koprowska captured the characters through the use of their prison letters. Some of the reviews actually referred to this more as a kind of docudrama because it drew so heavily on their prison letters. The review includes a quotation from one of these letters in which Ethel described Jewish culture and arts as something from which she drew personal fortitude. She wrote, quote, "The dramatic power and the beauty of Jewish singing, which expresses the tremendous creativity of Jewish people and their ability to fight for freedom, filled me with happiness and pride," unquote. Later in the same Yiddish Schriften review, one of Julius's letters is quoted, referring to his and Ethel's upbringing as having been, quote, "based on a real melding of our American heritage with our Jewish heritage, which to us means freedom, culture, and human worth, which made us what we are," unquote. It seems likely that Kamińska's drive to translate and perform the play stemmed from the potential it offered to be both commercially successful and its strategic demonstration of its terrorizing narrative of Jewishness amidst ongoing post-war reckonings with Polish Jewish possibility. The apprehensive status of open discussion of Jewishness in Poland existed alongside the ongoing navigation of post-war Polish identity, given the new political climate. And it's important to note that just a year or so after this production in 1954, the period of the so-called Gomulka Aliyah begins. The lack of textual Jewish specificity offers insight into the ways in which Jewishness in this play provided a floating signifier for how Poles were able or unable to discuss their difficult history at that point. Furthermore, Koprowska's narrative, heroizing two American Jews as characters intended to be universally appreciated humans and communists, fascinatingly counters Judeo-Communist narratives. By creating a narrative about two American Jewish communists and specifically divorcing them from any textual or performed references to that Jewishness, Koprowska essentially normalizes them both as communists and Jewish. Rather than heralding the Rosenbergs as not just American, rather by heralding the Rosenbergs as not just American or Soviet, but international heroes dying for their communist beliefs, the play performs their universal utility, essentially erasing deleterious or harmful anti-Semitic associations from the previous historical period. They instead become useful tools for demonizing the capitalist American system. The play projects one take on a communist era possibility for new Jewish identity, its own contribution to optimism couched within a communist heroic martyrdom. In conclusion, these two plays performed within the first post-war decade in Poland reveal contrasting approaches to Polish Jewish cultural performance at this time. On the one hand, both seeming to undercut narratives of specifically Jewish martyrdom, each played dialogues with different political nuances created and supported by Yiddish artists who survived the war. The simultaneous use and elision of Jewishness and performance that overlap with changing politically circumscribed cultural censorship offers valuable insight into the Yiddish theater's role in demonstrating the changed and multifaceted usages of Jewishness and Yiddish during that time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really interesting paper, and it's good to see that there's questions already in the chat as well. And now I would like to invite Karolina Koprowska from Jagiellonian University, her paper.
So as you can see in the presentation, I added a small citation to the title, Mit Hoffnung und Glauben, which indicates the main direction or frame of my analysis, and actually make my thinking about the Yiddish culture in post-war Poland more precise, or I hope it does at least. I will begin my presentation with reminding of a scene which ends a full-length documentary in Yiddish from 1948 entitled Mir Leben Gebliebene, We the Survivors. This movie reveals the scale of destruction and disaster after which the Jewish community strove to build a new life in a socialist reality of the post-war Poland. In the movie, we see two phases of the immediate after the war period. On one hand, the shadow of the Holocaust introduces an atmosphere of despair, grief, and loss. On the other hand, it is a period filled with creative energy, optimism, and new possibilities to revive the Jewish life in Poland. Nathan Gross, one of the movie's directors, admits that their intention was to grasp both angles of the post-war condition of Jewish survivors. As he explains, delving into the history of our destruction makes sense if it is connected with our rebirth. The document ends with the affirmation of life. The narrator says, Mit Hoffnung und Glauben, als die Sinn wird wieder vor uns scheinen, als am Israel chai, azoi glauben mir die Leben gebliebene. So with hope and faith that the sun will shine for us again, that the nation of Israel is alive, this is what we who have survived believe. These words are followed by a scene montage that illustrates the key moments for the rebuilding Jewish community. They are accompanied by the song Scheint die Sonne schon wieder, and the sun shines again, performed by Cantor Moshe Serenson. This metaphorical final sequence emphasizes the meaning of hope, Hoffnung, and faith, Glauben, for the Jewish survivors' condition, as they allowed them to overcome the feeling of despair and plan possible future in Poland. Such a conclusion triggered then my thinking on how affects, especially hope, influenced the process of rebuilding Jewish life in the immediate after the war Poland, I mean in years 1944-1948. In my analysis, I refer to the concept of Jewish hope, which determines survival and continuity. In his essay Toward a History of Jewish Hope, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi investigates the phenomenon of hope in the Jewish past and present on both collective and individual levels. He differentiates two kinds of hope in Jewish history. On one for a goal that transcended history, and the other for improved conditions and survival within history. Convinced that Jews lived on both eschatological and historical planes, he was intrigued by the eschatological hope for the messianic end of days promised in the Bible and expressed in daily prayers. But he was equally drawn to a more ordinary kind of hope, what he called interim Jewish hopes for the times before the end of time. The two kinds of Jewish hope distinguished by Yerushalmi prompt different existential attitudes. The hope that determines the messianic faith and religious trust in the divine presence implies a passive expectation of what is to come. The hope that accompanies living in the diaspora reveals its active potential. It calls for action and efforts to fulfill or to avoid a potential scenario of events. It is also worth to mention that hope appears in the face of historical defeat. This is also a quotation from Yerushalmi, in the face of historical defeat. and that this historical defeat includes historical moments when the existing status quo is being violated or ruptured, and as a consequence, a sense of threat, uncertainty, and anxiety is increasing. In philosophical approaches, starting with that of Thomas Hobbes, hope is related to fear, since both affects are of anticipatory character. We both fear and expect what may come in the future. The Jewish hope, as Yerushalmi explains, is also intertwined with this state of uncertainty. And I quote, "We cannot explore the history of Jewish hope without at the same time exploring the history of Jewish despair." On the existential level, hope evokes an ability to overcome the experience of failure, doubt, or despair, and it in fact encourages human action, as it is expressed in the essay by Rebecca Solnit, "Hope in the Dark," and you can see an excerpt from this essay and some other quotation from Dabin. It is his understanding of the concept of Jewish hope by Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, and I will skip to the next slide. Okay. So in case of Jewish hope, the potential of hope to encourage human action is strengthened by the need for historical and generational continuity, which is rooted in Jewish tradition. Yerushalmi combines Jewish hope with three temporal dimensions. It is not merely an expectancy which draws its nourishment from the future while integrating and permeating the present. It has its roots in the past and collective memory. It means then that hope may be evoked when the individual can identify himself or herself with a community whose past testifies to its resilience, survival, and capacity to rebuild after the disaster. The Jewish hope, which involves domicile in concrete political and social conditions, can be applied to the attempts of recreating Jewish community in post-war Poland. And I am specifically referring to the Nusach Poland project, which intended to build a secular and to some extent autonomous Jewish culture in Yiddish language. In 1944-1948, the project was intensively developed, as it included various cultural, institutional, and literary activities, firstly concentrated in Łódź and Wrocław, and from the end of the 30s in Warsaw. In the context of the history of Jewish hope, the Nusach Poland project can be understood as a strategy of feeling at home, of settling into the post-war reality, the stake of which is not only to adapt to new living conditions, but also to create a place for Jewish Yiddish culture within the Polish post-war space. In other words, to maintain cultural, linguistic, and identity distinctiveness. The Nusach Poland project grew out of the desire and need of the Jewish survivors to assert their will and ability to exist and to act anew. And here are some examples. Efroim Siedlecki emphasized that the artists and writers who came to Lublin in 1944 were united by the need for creative activity. "We felt an inner impulse to do something," he wrote in Yiddish Schriften. Philip Friedman admonished, and I'm quoting, "Now is not the time to shed tears, tear our garments, or sprinkle ashes on our bereaved heads. It's time to act." Avram Zak was really impressed by the optimism of Jewish writers from Literatenverein, and he recalls this atmosphere. "How great, how extraordinarily great is the power of the Jew, the strength of his will to create." And one more example, recalling the atmosphere of liberated and depressingly deserted Lublin, Nachman Blumenthal also wrote about moments of national agitation, about the unimaginable energy with which the remnants of Polish Jewry set about rebuilding their national life. The immediate after the war Yiddish literature reflects and supports striving for action and continuity. For this purpose, it uses the metaphors of hope that are related to nature and especially to nature's ability to revive and regenerate itself. These metaphors express an existential resilience of those who survived the war. This kind of adaptation and resilience pattern may be observed in one of Leib Olitsky's fables, and you can see now this fable on your screens. The fable is entitled Der Baum, der Pniak und seine Rittlech, the tree, the stump and its twigs, which was included in the first part Zum Bauen und Schaffen, on building and creating of the prose collection Der Mensch wird gut sein, Men Will Be Good, from 1947. Der Baum, der Pniak und seine Rittlech is an allegoric story about the fate of Jewish nation after the Holocaust. Namely, it tells the story that after cutting down a tree in the forest, only 4 thin twigs remained on its stump. However, it turns out that despite the severe frost and snow, 3 of them survived and in addition have green buds, which confirm their endurance and promise further growth. Only the 4th twig is getting weaker and weaker and eventually dies. And this earlier, before his death, the 4th twig represents the healthy ones enjoying the sun's rays. And you see this marked fragment. This is the 4th twig represents the healthy ones. How can we afford the sick twig wonders to breathe and turn green on this blackened edge of our stump? The fable ends with a didactic punchline. You can see over there. These are not the most faithful sons of the nation who lament over its destruction and go away in solitude. Only those who protect the ashes under their hearts in order to bring its safe glow to future generations. In Yiddish literature, planting not only indicates a metaphor of resilience and possibility of new existential condition, but also becomes a practice of establishing the post-war reality. It is in this context that it appears in Shloime Berlinsky's short story, The Yelins, written in 1945 in Tashkent, which captures the atmosphere of joyful anticipation of the very soon end of the war. It is kind of an agrarian flurry, so to speak, that anticipates a coming breakthrough. And I will read this paragraph in English. The earth has become particularly dear to people. It began to be decorated and robed. Never before have so many trees been planted as at the beginning of this summer. Not so long ago, the ground was a place for tunnels, ditches, and mines. Its roads served cannons, tanks, infantry, and mounted regiments. Now it is free, ready to be sown, plowed, planted, and indeed, people planted. Almost everyone felt the need to restore the earth to its destiny. In Yiddish, we have here, geben der Erd ihr Ticken. So they took home small trees or some seeds. Or maybe while sowing and planting, people subconsciously wanted the tree to replace their son, husband, lover, or even a lost foot or hand. And when the first green leaves and the first flowers appeared, people had the impression that a new world is sprouting, that a new world is dawning, a new world. The practice of planting trees reveals a twofold dimension, both reconstructive as it promotes natural regeneration, fixing the world, and predictive as it is future-oriented. The result is what Tim Jackson in his study calls a canopy of hope. So literally, in the case of trees, the deep roots and protective foliage that stabilize the climate, improve the soil, and protect the livelihoods of those who depend on them. Metaphorically, it is a symbol of the strength of our commitment to the future. So the natural acts of fixing the world described in the excerpt from Berlinsky's short story are a manifestation of an impulse to restore order in the world, which was disturbed during the war. They are also treated anthropocentrically. After all, it is said that new seedlings are supposed to fill the void and replace what has been lost. The anthropocentric framework of the process to revive the natural environment is revealed also in the reflection of the main character Mordechai, who is called the last of the Yelin family. And he said, it is the last paragraph of this story. It is the same with the whole nation, he thought. So he isn't said he thought about it. It is the same with the whole nation. He thought, after all, the root of the nation has not been destroyed. Several branches have been torn off, but the trunk is still stuck in the ground. And again, the sun will shine, and again, the dew will fall, and the nation will flourish and grow again. The perspective of hope allows to reflect on tension between two groups of Jewish survivors, those who survived the Holocaust and those who lived through the Soviet occupation. In the poem, Gesegnung, Farewell, Yeshayahu Spiegel juxtaposes the experience of two Jews who met at the end of the summer of 1946 in a village in Lower Silesia. The first one survived the war in the Soviet Union and thus did not experience Nazi extermination, at least not directly. The second one is a witness who survived the Holocaust. Both of them confront the post-war emptiness, the loss of family and home, but while the former expresses his confidence in a more beautiful and better life and a fruitful good victory for humanity, von a schöner und a besser Leben und a bliendiger, guter menschlicher Nizochen. The latter, so the survivor of the Holocaust, is deprived of this belief. He emphasizes that from the depths of his soul, he tried to bring out the slightest twitch of hope and faith, but under the pressure of despair, grief, and hatred, it turned out to be impossible to find consolation. He carries the burden of trauma and guilt of the survivor, which makes his further life an extension of his wartime experience. So he says, I'm surrounded by crowds with burning hands, and every wall of the ghetto, our disgrace, becomes a grave anew which extinguishes my life. Due to their different ways of survival, the characters of Spiegel's poem are unable to communicate with each other. The former advises the latter to forget about what he experienced during the war, while the latter accuses him. It is easy for you to say that, brother, as well as for all those who were not here with us. Der ist leicht, so zu sagen, Bruder, wie alle die, was seien da mit uns zusammen nicht gewesen. They also have different vision about their future. From the perspective of Holocaust survivor, the domestic space is marked by death and recurring after images of the Holocaust, and thus it evokes an impression of the uncanny. It turns out to be close and familiar, and at the same time alien and uncomfortable. For example, he speaks of the dead foundation of the house, Teute Fundamenten in einem Haus, or the lack of traces of the destroyed home, mein verkeuleter Stub. He points out that it is impossible to restitute his former home, and he asks rhetorically, can a tree that was uprooted from the ground during a thunderstorm, can such a tree bloom again? And I will read in Yiddish because I didn't put it on the screen, on the slide. Sie kennen Bäume, was wird mit seinen Wurzeln in einem Sturmblitz von Erd gerissen. Sie kennen a Bäume, also wieder blieben. So in conclusion, the survivor of the Holocaust, decides to leave. And the second protagonist of the poem is instead building a new home, new life in Poland. And he says, Oh, look, I have a white house in a lush field where the Nazi plague once spread. Now my buckwheat field blooms peacefully at my feet. The potato field ripening under the sky is golden. And my house, whitewashed in summer peace, longs so much for my eyes. So he simply admires the surrounding landscape, clouds, sunrise and blue dew, pine forest and rays playing in the treetops. The nature brings him aesthetic solace. What is more, the summer landscape corresponds with his desire for rebirth. He sees the meaning of his new life in the mission of repeating Adam's task, namely in maintaining genealogical and generational continuity. He says, I'm a pioneer, the first Jew, der Breishes Dikarit, who brings new generations into the world to a free and beautiful land. He settled down. Okay, I'm finishing here. He settles down and develops his rootedness by cultivating the surrounding land and at the same time by caring for future generations. So to conclude, the process of constituting a place for Jewish and Yiddish culture in post-war Poland in this period immediate after the war period was built on performing Jewish hope, both in cultural and literary practices. Hope functioned in them as a tool for survival and action. It brings promise of a new life and provides emotional resilience in the face of uncertainty, fear, and threats experienced by Jews in the immediate after the war reality. The belief in the possibility of overcoming the trauma of the Holocaust and rebuilding Jewish life in Poland, expressed primarily by Jewish returnees from the Soviet Union, was associated with the perception of Jewish history as dynamic of ruptures and continuation, catastrophe and rebirth, despair and hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was really, again, fascinating paper. And our last speaker is Aleksandra Gluba-Pieprz from Adam Mickiewicz University. And once again, thank you to all of these who already put the questions in the chat.
Hello, thank you. Good evening. First of all, I would like to express that I'm honored that I can take part in this event. So I want to share my screen with you, and I hope it works. Yes? Everything okay. So the title of my presentation is Immersed in the Past, the Churban as a Crucial Topic in the Yiddish newspaper Volksstimme after the March 1968 anti-Semitic campaign in Poland. At the beginning, I would like to tell something about my research. It's a part of the grand project Jews in Poland in the aftermath of the 1967-68 anti-Semitic campaign, biographic experience, identity changes, and community dynamics. I work in cooperation with Marcin Sternawski, Anna Zawadzka, and Piotr Forecki. The main goal of my research in this project is analyzing the newspaper's content in the context of the anti-Semitic campaign, comments, reports, commemoration, contacts with diaspora, etc. My research includes the period between June 1967 until the end of 1991, when the newspaper was closed. Today I will switch the slides, but I will talk about other stuff in the meanwhile. Today I would like to present the history of the Yiddish and Yiddish-Polish periodical Volksstimme, published in Poland from 1946 until 1991 as a Holocaust commemoration initiative. The presentation will refer especially to the most dynamic period in the newspaper's existence between March 1968 until the end of 1969, in the period following the anti-Semitic campaign in Poland. My presentation will concern the crucial role of Holocaust commemoration in the Volksstimme in the late 60s and 70s today, in the first decade after the march. My research is still in progress and I have limited time, so I would be able to present just some highlights, preliminary conclusions and thoughts, sometimes also rhetoric questions, which I'm concentrating on. At the beginning, I would like to remind shortly some facts about the March 1968 campaign. It was a socio-political crisis in post-war history of Poland. The anti-Semitic campaign had begun in June 1967 during the Six-Day War and escalated in March 1969. The results were repressions against Jewish society from the governmental side, but also against individuals. There were plenty of direct acts of anti-Semitism in workplaces, schools, etc. In effect of this brutal campaign, around 13,000 Jews were forced to leave the country with one-way travel document. March events and their impact on the Jewish community in Poland are undeniably noticeable in the biggest and only Yiddish newspaper in Poland at that time. I consider Volksstimme before the escalation of the anti-Semitic campaign as a living Jewish newspaper, which, short after March, got weaker and began the fight for existence. Of course, I'm aware about the scale of the propaganda dimension and the political influence on the journal. In the interwar period, around 50% of the global Yiddish press market based in Poland. After the war, until 1956, in Poland were published around 80 different titles of the Jewish press, not only in Yiddish, but also in Hebrew and Polish. After 1956, because of the governmental restrictions and anti-Semitic politics, only one newspaper left, and it was the Volksstimme. In this slide, of course, I show you the frequency of the how the frequency of the publication varied, but I want to concentrate on this propaganda content, which we can observe on the picture. So here we have the Marszałkowska Street in 1945, and now in 1972. It was a former pre-war Jewish district in Poland, in Warsaw, sorry. And the picture illustrates the progress of in the country's post-war reconstruction. The specific Yiddish newspaper was used for building a model and conception of the real Polish Jew who supports every decision of the government, who is the member of the working class, cares about the national economy, and who uses Yiddish to propagate an idea of Polish-Jewish integration. That is also a pressure of assimilation. The founding idea of the magazine, apart from ideological motivations, was, among others, integrating the Jewish community after the war, searching for relatives. The newspaper regularly published columns dedicated to the Polish Red Cross's ongoing search for people still missing after the war, and to news about the investigations of war criminals in the West. After the March campaign, Volksstimme immersed in the past deeper than ever before. I'm wondering if keeping the readers in the past wasn't the strategy of keeping Jewish identity, but I'm also thinking and considering it as a specific way of mourning after Polish Jewry, after the pogrom in 1968. On the other side, it could also be an ideological governmental strategy for creating the figure of Polish Jew who is turned only to the past, not to the future, which was in the interest of the governmental apparatus. This is how the end of Polish Jewry was to come. This entire newspaper is built on ashes. The Holocaust is the main topic, context, point of reference. March can be perceived as a final chord of the Holocaust. In the effect of the mass emigration of Polish Jews, the Jewish life in Poland was strangled. The Volksstimme journalists and editors, who were themselves Holocaust survivors, explored the influence of their personal experiences on the shape and content of the periodical. In writing about the past, they were by the same token writing about the present, and as they worked through the historical material, they were simultaneously working through their individual trauma. The Volksstimme focused on commemorating specific events and figures, for example, Janusz Korczak, Emanuel Ringelblum, Mordechai Anielewicz, the ghetto uprisings in Warsaw and Białystok, the extermination camps. In this regard, the Volksstimme can be understood as a sort of Hiskorbuch for Polish Jewry. main thought, which follows me during the research, is that there must be an additional narrative layer, which was readable and understandable for Polish Jews who were oriented in the cultural context, which haven't been recognizable for the Polish censors. I'm recognizing Volksstimme as a Jewish press that referred to the interwar model of Yiddish press, evidence the continuity of the tradition of publishing Yiddish literature and informing about the diaspora's life. Therefore, I tried to read, interpret, and capture the narration, metaphors, subtexts, vivid connections to the cultural and national values, which couldn't have been communicated straight, but which might be an element of an unofficial mission of the paper, the mission of rescuing Polish Jewish identity. In this perspective, I'm looking at the journal as the way of preservation and empowering the remains of Jewish life in Poland after the Holocaust and obviously after the march. Moshe Szklar, who was a co-worker of the Volksstimme, he wrote an autobiographical article where he describes a very meaningful metaphorical act of resistance. And that was publishing this very famous song of Mordechai Gebirtig, which was published in the April 1968 in the special issue of Volksstimme, which was published for 25th anniversary of the uprising in Warsaw Ghetto. And he mentioned that that was readable for every Polish Jew, that this is the time when the exodus had begun again. And another example of this kind of undertext or metaphorical allusion for readers was publishing the canonical manifesto of very famous Polish Jewish poet Julian Tuwim. And in the beginning of 1969, so in the middle of the anti-Semitic campaign, in Volksstimme was published the Yiddish translation of his manifesto under the title "We Polish Jews, Mir Polische Jiden," which was originally written in the United States in 1944, where Julian Tuwim spent the time of the Second World War. In the column Yiddishenize, because I had to go further, which was devoted to Diasporas life, there were published informations about trials against Nazi criminals, but also about important book premieres, for example, about Yitzhak Bicher. In the Volksstimme was implemented the feeling of the loneliness and isolation through publishing a lot informations about Western racism and anti-Semitism. The term anti-Semitism appeared only in the context of West, never in the articles about the situation in Soviet Union, what's obvious in this propaganda newspaper. The isolation is visible, especially in Polish context. The reports about the Jewish life in Poland don't go beyond the TSKZ, so the society activities, and other institutions which were controlled by the country, like Jewish Historical Institute. The history of Holocaust was also treated instrumentally. Another important topic, crucial especially in the context of post-March political history in Poland, was the Reichstums among the nations. The topic of the Reichstums among the nations appeared the parallels between the past and the present. It was used to erase the Polish guilt of anti-Semitism in the past and in the present. And we can observe also the growing role of the political history in Poland. There were also taboo topics, like in particular the participation of Poles in the extermination of Jews, as well as the post-war pogroms in Kielce, Radom, and Kraków. The connotations with Holocaust experiences we can find in the non-fictional narrations about March, which describe the specific atmosphere, panic and fear, growing need of finding shelter, dealing with personal aggression. After the March 1968 campaign in Poland, the Volksstimme transformed from newspaper dedicated to the idealistic vision of rebuilding Jewish life in Poland to an organ deeply immersed in the past, sometimes nostalgic, sometimes doubtful. Another factor that symbolically situated the Volksstimme in the past was Yiddish, the language of the exterminated Polish Jews. And here we have, I'm using this word shelter because Bogdan Wojdowski, an author of the story Alka, which was published in Volksstimme since 1973, he wrote and he declared that Volksstimme was his only shelter after 1968, where he could publish his works. And here we have also another examples. For example, one very famous post-war Yiddish poet, Eli Reisman, who survived in Soviet Union. He settled down in Western Pomerania in Szczecin, and he wrote and he published in Volksstimme in Yiddish, of course, until 1975 when he died, when he passed away. And another example of institution which is very important, of course, also in this the biggest in the wider context of Volksstimme is Jewish theater in Warsaw, because all of these institutions officially cooperated. So here we have an example of information about the premiere in Jewish theater in Warsaw. So this is how this cultural why this newspaper could be was a shelter or a space where the Jewish culture could grow somehow in this specific time. And for those who remained in Poland, the anti-Semitic campaign of 1968 was also a stimulus to save memory, but also a concern for its continuation and education to the next generation. There were made efforts to preserve memory, tradition, culture, language, but also, of course, the material heritage. And that's all. Thank you very much. Asheinem Dank.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all these papers. This was a really fascinating panel, and I'm incredibly happy and privileged to be part, to be moderating it. So thank you very, very much. And we have a lot of questions already, so I will allow our participants to speak. We have Sven, for example, seems to have questions for everyone.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful panel. I have a question sort of about Yiddish and Polish that maybe is going to pose to both Aleksandra and to Simo, and that is, so to what extent in the case of the Volksstimme, to what extent could Poles in Jews in Poland read Yiddish? Could the younger generation read it, or did they? And was there also a Polish journal, a Polish language journal, other than the Volksstimme, or was that really the one Jewish publication? And to what extent is your sense that it did function as a kind of unifying a way of kind of pulling the community together? You've mentioned that it was kind of the one safe place that some people felt that they, especially after the anti-Semitic campaign. But in general, was that the only one, or was there a Polish language one as well, and how widely was that read? And a kind of related question, a related question for Simo was, and Hannah had some thoughts that maybe we should be careful about assuming that the children in the film Unsere Kinder could not speak Yiddish, but that was my understanding, both from Rivka's talk yesterday and from a lecture that I saw the Polish-American writer Henryk Greenberg give, who was one of the children in that movie. I was surprised when he mentioned that, and he said that he was not in a ghetto. He was in hiding, had not grown up speaking Yiddish, and was hiding with his mother, passing as Catholic, so they didn't really have any opportunity to learn Yiddish or be in that environment. So he definitely didn't speak Yiddish. But he said that most of the other children didn't speak Yiddish and they learned their lines phonetically. And he said that if you spoke Yiddish, you had very little chance of surviving. And so that was his case, Hannah saying that might be ideologically motivated. But at any rate, taking him at his word, if the children didn't speak Yiddish, Simo, I'm just wondering, this kind of vision of reconnecting with the Yiddish tradition as a kind of therapeutic process, was that something that could maybe work for adults, even if they're thinking, as in the film, that it's going to be the next generation? They're the ones that need to connect to Shalom Aleichem to be the next door to carry it on. Maybe it kind of skips the children but serves as a bridge to the adults. Or I'm just wondering, but I know that in Sweden also there was a continuation and learning of that the children did learn Yiddish for another generation at least, so that maybe it did work. But I'm just wondering about that. Is there a kind of generational gap or not? Thanks.
We have a comment from Anna Sternis exactly on this question as well. Anna, would you like to?
Oh, sorry, I just thought I would contribute to support what was said, so it's not a separate question.
Fantastic. So would the panelists like to answer those questions? Then we'll go with another set, because it was quite a lot.
So yes, I can answer about the Volksstimme and the Polish newspaper. Yes, there was a Polish newspaper dedicated to the youth, which was published between 1946 and the October 1968. And that was, the title of that paper was Nasz Głos, Our Voice. But after in the effect of the March campaign, it was closed, and then the newspaper, the Yiddish Volksstimme, was cut as or the profile of this newspaper was changed, and it wasn't anymore monolinguistic newspaper. We have it was the Nasz Głos, so the Polish newspaper was united with Volksstimme, and then the readers received the paper, which had around 9 or 10 pages in Yiddish and 3 or 2 pages in Polish. That depended on, for example, important anniversaries and specific events when. But never those parts were equal, and the content were different, and the topic, because it was still dedicated to the youth, which and the mission of this Polish part of the Volksstimme was education, and trying to also to interest the youth about Yiddish language, because it was also a big goal for other editors-in-chief and other people who created this paper.
If I may continue with the questions around the language of unsere Kinder, the Kinder in unsere Kinder. That question goes slightly beyond the point and discussion in my paper, and I think we have already quite excellent answers about the language. But what I found interesting in Eric's question was that did the children talk about these? Were they this encouragement to talk? Did that have an effect? And as Kabi Finder discusses this in his excellent article about unsere Kinder, and he has also interviewed some of the child actors, that children didn't really talk about their experiences. And this is something that I recently found in an excellent book that was published by Yad Vashem, After the Darkness. There are free chapters on the psychological rehabilitation. And also there, for instance, in UK, in similar kind of children homes, and also in the US, children in these facilities, they didn't really, this is what the caretakers wrote in their memoirs, and some of the children who also wrote about this issue, that children didn't talk so much about their experiences. They would maybe briefly say where they had been, what they'd gone through, but not really. And maybe it's also like Glickson and Feinsilber in Sweden, that they were mostly working, and Gold, they were working with young adults. Most of, this is also what Hannah asked about Sweden, most of the survivors that came to Sweden, they were in their 20s, 30s, mostly women, Polish Jews, Hungarian women who were brought in 1945. Later, there were other groups that came. But this is the generation that Glickson, for instance, Glicksons were working with, and Gold, and was perhaps something different. But what I found interesting in this dialogue in Unsere Kinder is that this is that they are also discussing that this approach concerns adults. This is what Nusha Gold says in her replique, that this is also for adults. And I'm interested how this kind of perhaps also I'm looking for sources that where is this discussed, this type of approach. And Janusz Korczak, I have to read his work more. Does Rachel Auerbach discuss this approach? If I understood right, that she has been responsible for these lines with Shimon Jigan and Israel Schumacher. That where does this come from, and what were they themselves thinking about this? And I'm still working on this. This is very preliminary thoughts about this whole thing.
Thank you very much. If anyone's interested in further discussion about Unsere Kinder and the language, it's here in the chat. And now we have another two sets of very interesting questions from Joel Berkowitz and Dominic Williams. If you'd like to ask your questions.
Thanks, Kasia. Questions about both performance and reaction to performance to Rachel and Simo. For Rachel, I had a question about to the extent that you're aware the sort of differences in just production, artistic choices, some of which may have been, as Dominic suggested, in a response, sort of resource issues of between Homens Mapola in different places, because it was staged in many different places. That appreciate that set design you shared, which is really striking, and the production photos, which are fairly widely known, of Homens Mapola in immediate post-war Paris, are very, very spare. That the backdrop is largely just sort of some curtains, and there isn't much of a set. And for Simo, I'm interested in that that theme of the potential therapeutic value of performance in the environment that you're talking about, and wondering whether you're encountering much more discussion of that from from sort of outside observers, not just the performers themselves, which is really fascinating to hear about, but are there other people sort of weighing in one way or the other, either sort of like critically like Lawrence Langer, or appreciatively, or in some other way?
Thank you. And Dominic?
I've got a question for Rachel. I had a question for Aleksandra, but I think you've answered it, so that was great. Rachel, I was just wondering. I mean, you were talking about these two Jewish, anti-Jewish concepts in post-war Polish society, po-żydowska society, or the Żydowskie, and Żydokomuna. I'm wondering how you saw those interacting, and how you saw the plays kind of navigating those. And in some ways, I suppose you answered that. I mean, that's what your paper was doing. But I wondered if you could at least say some more, or just go over it again so my tired brain can comprehend it. And I apologize if I'm just getting you to repeat it. Repeat yourself.
Who'd like to start?
I can jump in if that's okay. So thank you for those questions. I'll start with Joel's question, which unfortunately is going to be pretty limited. I came across this in actually 2 set designs for Hamas Mapola very recently. So now this has opened up a much bigger question about, well, I was already looking for specific production photos for this. I mean, how much are these going to look like the actual production? I appreciate the comment that Dominic had put in the chat about state funding resources. However, this would have been a bit too early, and TSKZ was not even officially formed yet. Which was in 1950. So there's some big questions, I would say, about the elaborate nature, and also in terms of the play's dramaturgy being very far from any sort of naturalism or realism. The sets themselves seem a little bit heavy-handed in that sense, and I found a note in a review about Turkov, the director, using paper crowns to sort of underscore, you know, the fictitious, sort of the fanciful nature, right, of this world. And I also I was curious, you know, are those also paper crowns getting distributed to the audience? What is the level of sort of interaction also to that extent? But that's a whole, so it's a can of worms I'm still looking into, and I'm hoping to find more information about what the actual dynamics of this were like. Though I will also underscore, they had no problem getting audiences. So there was a certain level of money coming in to be able to eventually support a bigger resource production, but that wouldn't necessarily have been there at the beginning. And then thank you also, Dominic, for this question. If it's okay to jump into that as well. Yeah, this is. I like how you worded it also in the chat about the kind of the 2 poles between Żydokomina and Pożydowskie.
Entirely unintentional there. So
right, yeah. Yeah, I had to read it twice.
I only struck me down.
But I mean, I think you're pointing to exactly this incredibly complex and unavoidable tension, in which post-war Jewishness in Poland existed between a mythos of ever-presence and ever-powerful and actual absence, entire absence. And I think the plays are approaching this in 2 different ways. In particular, Hamas Mapola is attaching itself to a kind of larger transnational community in that moment to say that not only are we still here, but there's a Deborah Kaplan's term, right? We have a Yiddish empire, you know, there's still a transnational connectivity of this play that's going on. And it extends beyond Poland as a way of community reformation. But I think Julius and Ethel is doing this in a very different way because, of course, it's contending with a very present popular narrative in a Polish cultural sphere at that time. And so it's taking on a very particular Polish anti-Semitic mythos as well, and doing that, and almost to the extent that it doesn't need to contend with Pożydowskie in that moment, because Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are already on stage also in a Polish sort of context, if that makes sense. So Jewishness, though it's subversively in the fore, is still very much there as well. I have more to say also about how it very much embeds Holocaust-specific memory, which I saw that Hannah put in the chat as well. But I don't want to jump into that too much yet. It subverts. Let me draw this to a close. It subverts Żydokomina in that moment too by saying, "Look, we're just your average communist, right? We're just like you. We're also dying for the cause, which means we don't have power. These kind of things." So, Yes, I hope that got to both of these. Thank you.
If I may answer Joel's question, I'm still looking for those articles or anything that discusses this topic. I've discovered 3 memoirs, Glickson's, Feinsilber's, and Grober's memoirs. They talk about their time in Sweden. Glickson especially talks a lot about the meaning of these performances. He describes the situations and the kind of difficulties they faced because most of the a lot of the women were in very bad shape. They were in hospitals and they were in these convalescent homes. So that's something that was, yeah, kind of affected also those situations. But I'm looking if I could find survivor journals discussing this. The problem with Sweden is that this material is scattered all over the world. Those journals in Sweden, you can't find them in the libraries or archives, or you can find a couple of numbers, but then you have to go to Jerusalem, New York. So it's a headache to get to those sources. But I hope that there is some discussion about this, and also, of course, later many of those people who were in these convalescent homes, they've been interviewed. It would be interesting to find if they discuss later on the meaning and perhaps the psychological meaning of this for them.
It's a little quiet, and I'm eager to ask a question that's for all of these panelists. May I, Sasha?
Yes, I was just meant to say that now we have 15 minutes, perfect for a question. Numerous questions. Please, yes.
Thank you. And I allow myself to do that, you should know, because Kasia and I are very old and dear friends. So don't expect me to interrupt just anybody. So there's a serendipity to this panel, which is that we read your papers and we thought each one, of course, has a different theme and different materials and different theoretical frameworks. But we thought that this would work as a panel on new Yiddish diasporas. So we were thinking about space and place in your papers, and I'm not saying that was what you intended, but that was what we saw. And now that you're together again and you've been placed under this heading, what do you think of this heading? I mean, does it work for you? Do you think that there's something specific about the new Yiddish Yiddish language and culture that develops in post-war Poland? There's something new that develops about the Yiddish culture and language that develops in Sweden. Or is it just a global world culture that's circulating and it doesn't really matter where people are?
Could I maybe add something to that? just since you're talking about the applicability of the panel's title, I wonder if people have thoughts on the word diaspora as well. I mean, obviously, diaspora in Poland is rather different from diaspora in Sweden.
Right.
And I'd really like to hear from Karolina, especially after that really fantastic paper. Thank you so much for that. I mean, everyone was fantastic. It's just, you know, we haven't paid you enough. We've paid people attention. We haven't paid Karolina enough attention.
Especially, and then you could combine my my question that I put in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, Karolina, like that. Your work, your analysis of nature and earth was fascinating to me. Is it nature and earth at large, or the earth of Poland? So now you have the question of diaspora to deal with, and earth, nature, okay, the meaning of life, basically. We're at the quirky stage of the day.
And there's one more question from Sven. Would we like to ask him?
Yeah, it was for Rachel. I wondered, I was interested in this play as a translation into Yiddish in the post-war context, and translation into Yiddish was a huge part of Yiddish publishing all along, really, but less so for rather obvious reasons, perhaps. But after the war, but maybe not. I don't really know. So was this part of a wider phenomenon in post-war Poland? It seems there was an obvious sort of interest and a kind of both in terms of just a public interest in this phenomenon, this play that already existed in Polish and has a Jewish sort of side that could be taken up in Yiddish. And so there's a very good reason for translating this particular play in Yiddish. But was that something that was done? Were there other popular kind of plays or works that were published, translated into Yiddish after the war? Was this kind of a singular phenomenon? That I just wanted to ask that. Thanks.
I jump in, or Karolina?
I think maybe
Karolina?
Okay.
Karolina would like to.
Okay, so I will try to answer these questions. So the first one, Earth as nature or Earth as Poland, or both. I think that's an excellent remark, and I would say both, because it is Earth as nature in Poland. The authors I researched indicates the importance of nature as a tool of rebuilding the Jewish life, as a tool or pattern of resilience, so a kind of inspiration how to act anew. But in reference to the Nusach Poland project, it is to some extent understood that the future of Jewish life is in Poland. But it is interesting that I can't actually see or can't remember the clear references in literature to Poland, to this national, to country level. So I think that this literature expressed some kind of sense of belonging to Deutschkeit, maybe to here, and this belonging to here-ness in a broader sense. But I certainly need to think about it more and research this question, because it is also it is connected with the different one. The question of the ideological dimension of this hope I was talking about. So to what extent this hope was ideological. So, and the place question, I think I think the place question matters, because this Nusach Poland project has its specificity, and it was addressed to Poland. And I see this project as a way to overcome the image of Poland as cemetery, as the place marked by the Holocaust, and to overcome this trauma and this image of Poland as the place of Churban. So to overcome this image, it adds an additional value to this project of Nusach Poland. It was really an effort to rebuild this life in spite of this this image of Poland as Churban place. So that will be my answer.
So maybe I should continue this thought of Karolina, because I think that break of 1968, I think that those creators of this Volksstimme, the only newspaper which left after this gigantic phenomenon, which used to be Yiddish press in Poland in before, I think it was hard to admit that Nusach Poland project was failed, yes, and they tried to hold remains and to keep the language and to save the language and the culture, and that was tragic. I read this paper as a very I'm moved when I'm reading this newspaper. This is my feeling when I'm following the issue by issue, yes, and when I'm reading it, that there is kind of despair and hope. that maybe and somehow the young generation could continue this tradition but unfortunately there is no hope as before.
If I may say something about Sweden and this diaspora, I think I don't know what you think, but in my opinion, Sweden is kind of a forgotten Polish Jewish diaspora, which there's very little research about Sweden, and even and it still continues. Like many people stayed in Sweden, continued, and still Yiddish speakers in Sweden, and they speak Polish Yiddish. There's a very strong Polish Jewish identity, also survivor identity in Sweden, in the Jewish community. Even when Singer came to Sweden in 1978 to receive his Nobel Prize, and he gave a speech to the local Yiddish society in Stockholm, and he was amazed. He said it directly, that he was surprised about this like huge Yiddish audience and who spoke his language, his Yiddish. And it's something that it deserves researching, and Sweden is in many ways also its own type of. This goes back to Hannah, your first question. There are a lot of unique things about Sweden and the community that deserve researching.
And we have 4 more minutes, and Rachel. So we just managed to.
All right, thank you. Ben's question, there were certainly other examples even in the early post-war repertoire of some Polish works, but also sort of larger Soviet works. Like the year before, they performed the Optimistic Tragedy, which had been big across the broader Soviet bloc before Julius and Ethel. And then they called that Julius and Ethel an Optimistic Tragedy, kind of as a callback to that piece as well. But this is, I mean, I would say also there was a huge amount of pre-war material still in circulation. So yeah, not to say that it was all newly translated work. This, however, is the most significant example that I have come across in my research of a simultaneous work in Polish and in Yiddish performing across the country at the same time. So there is something significant about this overlap and intentionality in a way that kind of calls back to like the dueling Dibbuk and things like that earlier in the interwar period. So kind of a different approach to the material. And I would just add very, very briefly, if I may, to a question that didn't get asked, but that was in the chat, that I just wanted to say to Hannah's question about whether the Holocaust was present. And this goes to Sven's question too, about translation. Ida Kaminska, I think, did a marvelous job making a better version of Julius and Ethel than what Leon Kruczkowski had made. She changed a lot in her adaptation. I would call it not just a translation, but an adaptation. And the entire last scene is basically direct address to the audience. It's Julius and Ethel Rosenberg speaking to the tiny window in their cell as they're about to go to be executed. So there is a very clear allegory towards being put to death or being in a camp in the moments before death, speaking to their children that they will never get to see again, speaking to the public, asking for them to take care of the next generation, essentially, and try and move forward. So there's a lot more to say about that. But anyway, thank you so much for this.
Thank you, and we're perfectly on time. Thank you very much. It was a really, really incredible panel, and yeah, so thank you so much, and thank you for all the wonderful questions.
Thank you to Kasia for moderating, and I know it's been a long day, so that you are real heroes, and your work was amazing. I mean, I can't believe I'm so honored. And this is I'm just reeling with excitement from all that I've learned today.